Welcome. We're going to get this 4:30 meeting started. We do usually leave a little bit of grace period for people trying to park and find the place because we've designed Pondering Excellence to sit in the time of day when people who don't necessarily live and work on campus can get here. So I think most of you know I'm Janet Carlson. I direct the Center to Support Excellence. The Pondering Excellence series has been a monthly speaker series during the school year now this is our third year. Fourth. I think it's our fourth. It's our fourth year. Yeah. So, and I did it a year before you were here. Okay. So it's continued to grow. We started out with like one talk a quarter, and now we're monthly for all 3 quarters, which is great. And I'm very excited today. Jenny Langer-Osuna, our speaker, is also part of the CSET faculty group, and her work represents the core values of CSET, of which there are 3 fundamentals of the work at CSET. Promoting equity for all learners, developing leading teachers, which means teachers who have a presence in the profession in lots of different ways, and improving instruction, which is rather broad, which is why it escaped me for the moment, although we do have some specific ways we do that. And I feel like Jenny's work crosses much of that. I don't know exactly what she's going to do today, but I have a feeling we'll look at students.
Yes.
Okay.
And teaching.
Oh, okay, so
We'll look at both.
And her work on identity and its relationship with learning is one of my favorite new learnings in the last 4 years. And it's another reason I'm excited to have Jenny as our speaker today. Jenny's been at Stanford since 2014, and prior to that she worked at the University of Miami. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Janet and CSET, for inviting me to be here, and thank you all for coming. I am excited about the opportunity to speak to you today about some of the work that I've been doing on understanding and supporting collaborative math classrooms that foster both inclusive and productive engagement. So my work is broadly focused on teaching and learning mathematics in K-12 classrooms, and I focus in particular on understanding collaborative math classrooms, or classrooms where students are regularly expected to solve problems together in both small group and whole class discussions. And I'm particularly interested in how students engage in collaborative problem solving with one another when the teacher isn't around, which is typically in small group settings. And even more specifically, I'm interested in when students are engaged in collaborative work with one another, how students negotiate the collaborative dynamics and its effects on both the opportunities to learn and to identify as a learner and doer of mathematics. So I come from, the lens that I'm bringing into this is that in order to foster inclusive and robust learning environments, we need to attend to both how students construct mathematical knowledge together and mathematical selves with one another through classroom activity. And furthermore, that the interactions that make up both knowledge and identity construction need to really be understood together, not separately with respect to both research and pedagogy. So sociocultural theories of learning help us do that by positing that fundamentally learning and identity processes occur together through participation in learning activities with others. However, we still don't have much clarity on what exactly are the interactional mechanisms by which learning and identity processes affect one another. We know roughly that greater identification with mathematics can lead to more robust engagement, which can in turn lead to deeper and more robust identities as mathematics learners. But that broad point still somewhat frames learning and identification as sort of separate but related processes rather than more fundamentally integrated, which can lead to very different implications for teaching, where pedagogical strategies that might relate to one or the other, like cognitively guided instruction to support learning and culturally relevant pedagogy to support healthy identity development, rather than a more integrated approach where the teaching of content is directly supporting identity development and vice versa. And so what my work primarily posits, based on several findings that I'll share some of that with you today, is that student authority relations during collaborative learning activities. That is, the ways in which students interact around and negotiate positions of both social and intellectual authority really illuminates and clarifies that link in ways that build on and contribute to sociocultural theories of learning and have implications for professional development and classroom instructional practices. And now I want to, in this talk, kind of just lay out the argument and then take those implications for instruction and sort of leverage them to explain a PD study that supported by CSET that we've been working on since coming here. So to be even more specific, my work has found that student authority relations mediate the social construction of math knowledge through whose ideas become influential and therefore taken up as true or part of the solution path, and that student authority relations mediate the social construction of mathematics student identities through who becomes positioned as mathematically powerful. So today, I'd like to kind of break this argument down and make my case sort of piece by drawing on a few of my studies to illuminate each point. So in particular, I'm first going to argue that authority mediates the construction of knowledge by mediating influence. And then I'll illustrate that authority relations mediate the construction of mathematical selves by mediating students' positionality as central or not to the mathematics learning activities. And then I want to offer an example of an analysis that focuses on both functions simultaneously and how they interrelate. And then finally, I want to move on to some implications for PD and then focus on a PD study that took these ideas in partnership with teachers. So the first part of this journey begins in graduate school across the bay at UC Berkeley, where Randy Engel was at the time a new assistant professor with a hot new publication that many of you may have heard about. It's a 2002 paper with Faith Conant on productive disciplinary engagement. And in that paper, they analyzed a very heated student-led science debate to posit 4 principles that support productive disciplinary engagement. So one day, as a student working with Randy, she decided to show us the video of this case as part of discussing her paper. But as we watched it, another doctoral student at the time, Maxine McKinney de Royston, who's now at UW-Madison, we noticed that while certainly it was a case of robust, heated, even impassioned student engagement in a debate, there was something else about it that was pretty problematic. And in particular, the boy in the middle, who's standing up, was able to garner a great deal of influence about the debate, ultimately convincing all but one student, the girl who's sitting with a scrunchie, who became her nemesis, his nemesis, to change their minds and adopt his position, even though his arguments, compared to all the other participants, and in particular compared to his nemesis, were the sort of least quality arguments. They used the least amount of evidence and least amount of justification and whatnot. So we were just wondering, like, how did he become so influential? How did he shift the debate in the ways that he did when it wasn't necessarily about the quality of the argumentation? So we reanalyzed the case in a paper that eventually came out in the Journal of the Learning Sciences, and we wanted to model how students became influential or not. And what we found was that his influence and the relative influence of others emerged out of the negotiation of 5 kinds of interactions. So we found that the first were interactions around intellectual authority, which we defined as interactions during which a student is treated, acted, or evaluated as a credible source of information. The next was influence itself, which we defined as interactions that marked that a student's idea was taken up as true. The third was intellectual merit, which we defined as interactions during which a student's idea is positioned as high quality. And this may occur even if, like, objectively, or in sort of using Tolman's scheme of argumentation, the idea wasn't particularly robust, perhaps incorrect or even misleading, but it was socially oriented to as a good idea. And then the fourth is access to the conversational floor, which we define as the degree to which a student can initiate terms as desired and complete them without interruption. And then lastly, okay, and then Lastly is what we call spatial privilege, or access to the space, spatial privilege, which we define as the degree to which a student was visually attended to and physically oriented to when speaking. And so a key contribution of this work that we posited, and based on the case that we modeled, is that these interactions relate to and affect each other in particular ways. So it's not just that these kinds of interactions contributed to ideas becoming influential in a general sense, but that they worked with each other in ways that could be predicted. So I really like the methodology that we used here, and it's a methodology that I've continued to use again and again in work that focuses on social interactions, where we coded every utterance in terms of bids for the floor, or bids for authority, or bids for space, and then students' or peers' responses, whether those bids were taken up and accepted, or whether they were rejected. And this approach really helps us capture the interactional construction of particular social realities about students and their ideas, explaining how they became influential or not, and how particular students became positioned. So students who regularly bid and have those bids regularly rejected are positioned in ways that really demotes, say, these are bids around intellectual authority, really demotes their intellectual authority. Students who regularly bid for authority and that authority gets regularly taken up over time can really be positioned very powerfully within the group. So the figure here is one that we present, and it's complicated, and we don't have to totally get into it, about the relationships between these components, right? So for example, we found that students first needed to have access to the interactional space. That is, bodies were generally oriented to students or shifted towards students. And once we saw evidence of those shifts, of that increased access of space, they were much more likely to get the floor, right? Or the opposite. If they suddenly became kind of occluded or bodies turned away from them, then you see bids for the floor kind of get rejected and so on. And what we found was that this particular link here between authority and influence was particularly important. It was one of two kinds of interactions that led directly to influence, and the only interaction that was bidirectionally related to influence, such that becoming positioned with authority led to influence, and moments of influence led back to being subsequently positioned again with authority. And so whether positive or negative, this kind of loop could create the condition where pretty quickly a student could become very powerful relative to others. And so I really wanted to start unpacking this relationship and understand it further. So later on, not too much later, I had the opportunity to explore this relationship a bit more through an analysis of a 9th grade collaborative math classroom where I observed and videotaped focal small groups that work together at different points of the year. And I interviewed the focal students both on their math thinking and their experiences in the classroom. So these students worked in multi-team projects, multi-week team projects all year, and had group roles during each project. So my interest in this study was kind of broadly to better understand the relationships between different kinds of talk during collaborative mathematical work, and in particular how talk served to move the task or the mathematics in the task further, and how the talk served to position students as particular kinds of people, especially in relation to group and learning mathematics. So analytically, I focused on the functions of talk, and I focused on task-related talk, mathematics-related talk, as well as positional functions of talk, and how that was taken up by others. So unsurprisingly, the functions of talk were really largely mediated by their group roles. And one group role in particular, the role of group leader, enabled students the access to really kind of enacting a particular form of authority. That is, the authority to issue directives to peers in the management of tasks. And so I followed this particular group, 3 boys and a girl, who worked together at different points in the year. And during one project, Brianna was the group leader, and during another project, a boy, Kofi, was the group leader of the same group. So what I found was that Brianna and Kofi performed the group leader role very similarly, but the forms of their directives were similar, the substance of their directives were similar, even the delivery of their directives were similar. However, group members responded pretty negatively to Brianna's directives, significantly more often than Kofi's directives. So group members successfully took up an average of about 30% of Brianna's directives, resisted about 47% of them, and ignored or rejected around 23% of them. And in contrast, Kofi had very little trouble managing the group. In particular, his group members took up an average of about 77% of his directives, resisted about 16% of them, and ignored or rejected about 6% of them. So looking at the nature of their responses, the group members increasingly positioned Brianna as bossy, claiming that Brianna was overstepping her authority by assigning tasks and trying to keep students on task. And what you see in the right-hand figure is that over the course of the year, Brianna's is the one that starts really, really highly engaged at the top and then just plummets over the course of the year, even though she was an A student. She becomes totally marginalized from the group, spatially, conversationally, in ways that she then frames it as academically in some interviews that I later had with her. So in an interview, Brianna offers a very gendered interpretation of what happened. And so she asserts, boys don't listen to girls. I mean, it's not just in the classroom, but it's outside too. It's like, I mean, they think they can control you, especially at high school. It's like they think they can control you. They're the man stuff. You're supposed to listen and all that stuff like that. So that's why the last time in, if you remember, I was yelling at them. And so I asked, well, how would you describe yourself as a student in the class? And here you'll see that she recasts the experiences that she had with her group as having learned the lesson to stop working so hard and doing so much. And when I pushed her on this, a gendered interpretation emerged again. So she says, you know, at the beginning of the year, I mean, I was like a workaholic. So now I'm not so much of a workaholic, but I think it's because I have so much to do now. But I'm getting it. But before, I used to want it. Now I don't so much. So I think when I came in, I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that, and all that stuff. And I think that's what it was. And I was just doing a little bit too much, but now I feel like I'm doing enough. So I asked, well, what do you think is the negative of working hard? And she said, I think it's because when especially like being in a group, I think all I had was boys. So that also that put me in a tragedy. So Kofi, on the other hand, makes meaning of his experiences in ways that show increased belonging and a desire for more mathematics experiences. So I asked him the same question, how would you describe yourself as a student in this class? And Kofi answers, right now, I don't know, but I'm really interested in math. What do you like about it? It's challenging. It requires you to think. Before, it's not like English, where you just have to read and write. Math actually requires you to think about what you're doing first. It's like if you're doing an equation and notice something's wrong, so something in your brain goes like, let me figure this out and see what's wrong. And then once you figure it out, you feel accomplished. You feel like you accomplished something good, and it's kind of like a good feeling. Plus, it's like a workout for your brain too. So we see in this case that Brianna's enactments of authority, in particular the social authority of issuing directives to her peers, which were supported by the group leader role and frankly by the teacher himself, were rejected by peers in ways that were organized by gender and that seemed to marginalize her from the mathematical work of her group. The ways in which this group negotiated access to particular kinds of authority ultimately positioned Brianna as an appropriate and bossy, not competent and helpful, which was how Kofi was positioned for the very similar kinds of authority bids and with the same students. So it's a case that illuminates, I think, a couple of important things. One, that enacting authority is not a neutral act and does not simply emerge from local classroom norms, but can become situated in social and cultural histories around who gets to enact particular forms of authority. I think this is important because we're talking a lot about, especially in mathematics, but certainly in other disciplines, about the importance of student-led discussions and student-led work, and we're asking students to perform these kinds of performances of power, right, of intellectual power and of social power, which is really important, right, which we want students to do because they have these important implications of experiencing yourself as powerful, but we don't talk so much about what it means to ask particular kinds of students or to experience particular kinds of students enacting authority in ways that kind of socially and historically have not always been accepted. Another thing that comes out of this is that while intellectual authority is certainly central to what we're talking about, other more social forms of authority, in particular the right to issue directives, matters too in understanding how this is kind of going on. So, in bringing these ideas together, I applied these ideas to a case of collaborative problem solving among 2 fifth graders in order to track both the construction of a particular solution path and the positional identities between these 2 focal students. So I applied the influence framework to this case, looking again at bids for the floor, for space, for merit, for authority, and the acceptance or rejection of those bids. And this case is one that I think was particularly important because it's one where the interactional dynamics around authority very clearly and dramatically affected whose ideas mattered. In this case, Anna's ideas mattered, and Jerome's role increasingly became taking on Anna's voice rather than finding his own. And then the dynamics around authority very clearly also affected not only the construction of their particular solution path, but also their relative positionality. And it's also a particularly interesting case because Anna's ideas are actually riddled in confusion and fairly misleading. The actual paper goes, idea by idea in the construction of the solution. Here, I won't go into that because we'll run out of time. But what I do want to do is illustrate these dynamics through some video clips. Sorry, okay, there we go. So, in this first set of video clips, it shows how Jerome's engagement was perceived by the teacher and taken up by Anna. So in this data set, while we applied the influence framework, we also created new categories as necessary to capture the entire data corpus and found 2 other kinds of interactions very related to the original framework that we needed to take into account. One was the merit component, which we expanded to include both intellectual merit, or the perceived merit of ideas, but also social merit, or the perceived merit of sort of evaluation of behavior. We also found 2 forms of authority, intellectual authority as in the original influence framework, but also directive authority, the social authority to issue directives to peers, which really resonated with the findings in the Brianna Kofi case and was very powerfully impactful here. So before I dive into these coded interactional clips, I want to say a bit about the context of the work, just to sort of get some sense of what they're doing. So at the start of the lesson, students were expected to cut a word problem from a worksheet and paste it onto a shared poster. And this was generally taken as a one-person job. And across the classroom, you saw many partners waiting for that to occur before actually working on the problem together. But as you'll see, Jerome is really the only student who's regularly called out by the teacher for it. And the way he's seated also makes it difficult for him to be really close to Anna in the way that other students are with their partners, which might also affect how the teacher was perceiving and evaluating Jerome's behavior, which really sets up the dynamics that Anna later takes up.
Sorry, can you say what grade levels this is?
This is a 5th grade classroom in South Florida.
And obviously, you're with Ashley, and you're focusing on her, okay? Jermaine, please focus with Ashley. Real close, stand side by side so that you guys can work together.
It says they will only need 3 meters of rope. Are you gonna do the work?
Now that's what I want to do.
Oh, I should mention here that at this point in time, and for much of this opening part, there's been one contribution to the solution, where Jerome drew the first part of the representation of the solution at Anna's directive, but it's really been the only thing written so far. So when she's talking about, are you going to do the work and you haven't done anything yet, in reality, he's the only one that's written any kind of contribution. So he gets a little confused, like, what are you talking about?
We haven't done nothing yet. What? All you have done is this. Which is like a kindergarten can do that. Okay? Who just left? Who said she was gonna go?
We're gonna go on this group. I didn't ask anyone over here to move.
You can do nothing.
So Jerome's position as disengaged and problematically off task in relation to Anna was linked to Anna becoming positioned with the right to issue directives to Jerome, as you'll see in the next set of clips. Oops.
Read. Why I have to read? I don't feel like reading. Do you want to ask Taylor? Do you want to ask her? Read. How did you do that? Do that and cut it. Read now. That's how it looks like. 10 sections.
3 sections, 4 sections, 4 sections. Can I make the board in any shape I want? You're gonna have to read that. I want to see how you read it.
Let's just hurry up and draw the. You're doing it. Okay, I'm writing. So. We're doing it. You haven't done nothing yet. What? All you have done is this. Which is like a kindergarten can do that. Okay? I'm not helping you. You do it. You think. Because I've been doing it. That's what I'm doing. You're going to do something.
At the end of every period, to make sure you're understanding what is it.
Don't focus on this. Focus on the question.
What would that look like?
She said do this at the end.
Millimeters about what would that look like? If I
Erase this. You're just going to make a big mess on it.
that garden, you said the garden is a square section.
But you
This is gonna have thinking all over.
First one, do 3. Huh? 3 only. Okay? 3. Only 4 in that one, it says. Good. And then the rest of them. Okay, now read the next step. Come on. We have to work on the question. It doesn't matter. They're doing it. Because Miss Gordon said it's okay because they messed up. They didn't hear it. He said
So next you'll see how Anna's directive authority, which at this point has become quite thick between them, becomes intertwined with her intellectual authority as the nature of her directives increasingly includes the implementation of her ideas. And he just kind of keeps taking up her directives. And Jerome increasingly therefore starts asking Anna for help on implementing those ideas and treats her as a credible source of information.
Shape I want? I don't know. You're gonna have to read that. I want to see how you read it.
1 meter on each side. So you gotta put 1 meter in each one. And then 4 meters rope to rope. So that's 1 meter. So you gotta do it 10 times. Erase this. So you have there's 4 meters in each one. One. Okay, I could do that. First one, do 3. Huh? 3 only. Okay? 3. Only 4 in that one, it says. Good. And then the rest of them. These are 10. These I have 1 meter on each side. So there's 4 in each one. 35 meters. 35 meters is the answer. Alright, now we need to do these.
I don't know, are you good, you think?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. If you think that's good, then we'll go ahead to the next one.
Okay, now that's the complete answer. 70. You got it.
Because,
So
do you
you
want
can
to
say-
stand up and share that? Yes.
So you see across these clips that students that the authority relations was very central to the collaborative dynamics here, and that these authority relations were not shared. Rather, both social and intellectual authority was concentrated in Anna in ways that mediated both their solution and their relative positionalities. So with respect to their positionings, overall, this table shows the counts of particular kinds of interactional bids that were successfully taken up, which is the up part, or rejected, which is the down. And if you imagine sort of the net of the ups and downs, offering a kind of marker, a kind of weight to their relative positionalities, you see that, for example, with directive authority, Anna made 21 bids, 20 of which were taken up, only one of which was rejected, whereas Jerome made 7 bids for directive authority, 4 of which were rejected. So you can sort of see around social authority, Anna kind of has this net positional strength of 19 and Jerome of -1. And you see across the board with respect to intellectual authority, social merit, the intellectual merit, influence, access to the floor and space, that Anna becomes positioned as far more powerful than Jerome, along the same sorts of due to the same kinds of interactions that dictated how the construction of the solution path occurred. So in studying cases like this, my research team and I began to ask, well, how might we structure learning spaces in ways that would prevent this sort of domination from occurring, right? How might we structure group work in ways that all students have the opportunity to get a foothold into the discussion and freely share their ideas that get genuinely taken into consideration by others? In other words, how do we support more shared authority? So this brings me to the work that's been going on here at Stanford since I joined. I had the opportunity to partner with CSET and a local elementary instructional team to attempt to leverage these insights for professional development and further inquiry. So a couple of fortuitous opportunities arose my first year here. First, funding through CSET became available to support research meant to support elementary math instruction. And secondly, an instructional team at a local, culturally and linguistically diverse elementary school partnered with us through our teacher education program, reached out to me asking for support in implementing collaborative mathematics in their classroom. So this was a great opportunity to support their needs and sort of their instructional goals, and at the same time kind of have these 5 different teachers, these 5 classroom spaces where we could kind of tinker with these ideas, see what kids were doing with one another during these collaborative activities, and just kind of keep working with teachers and learning. So there were many aspects of our work together, but here I want to focus on our video clubs, whose purpose was to elevate teachers' noticing of students' collaborative dynamics. In particular, these were videos of their own students in their own classrooms, focusing in particular on the table work that the teachers don't usually get to have a sneak peek of. So here, teachers watched their and their colleagues' students at work, and we had them ask themselves, how are students negotiating this work, and to what effect? To what effect on who participates and in what ways, to what effect on their mathematical thinking, to what effect on progressing through the task, and so on. So it was this sort of integrated conversation that focused on how they were negotiating their dynamics, especially around authority, and sort of what effects it had writ large. And then we had them, after sort of voicing a lot of noticings, ask, well, what would students need to deepen their work with one another, and what might you try out in the classroom? So we didn't give them particular things to do. We invited them into sort of shared noticing and shared reflection, and then different teachers had sort of different ideas about what they might try, which gave us a great opportunity on the research end, because we had these different trajectories of shifts in instructional practice that we can then document and analyze, of which 2 have surfaced as particularly powerful, and I'll just share a little glimpse of those. But here's a quick example of the kinds of videos we watched, and This one's from a 4th grade classroom. And while you watch it, I kind of want you to focus on, for instance, how students in this case are interpreting what it means to be inclusive. That is, what were their attempts to share intellectual authority with one another?
I'm noticing something about.
Let me just give you a little bit of context. So they are all, the original task is for them to represent a particular number with, in sticks of tens and ones and loose cubes. Eventually, the teacher realizes that there's not enough cubes for everybody to represent it on their own, so she has them work as a table. So at this point, they've started making their individual sticks, but now they're going to join forces.
The cube. Can I have your eyes, please? I'm waiting for table 2 and table 1. I'm noticing that you do not have enough cubes to make 57. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I am going to change my mind. You can work as a table to solve it. Okay? I'm going to give you 10 minutes to do that. So we need to be cooperating as a table and sharing.
We just made 7. Wait, how many more do we need? 4. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 7. 7. We already have 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, but don't we supposed to make 6? Oh no, we did 5. Yeah, I know, that's right. 7. 7. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 more. Yeah, 1 more. There, we're done. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, take 1 out. No, take 1 of yours out because we don't have money of 5. Take yours. This one's not mine. Who's it? Oh, it's mine. Which one's yours? Mine are these 2. Mine is this one. No, wait, mine is this one. That's right, take it out. Because one also needs to be in here. Wait, so which one's yours? What? Which one's yours? Just 1? No. Wait, whose is this one? Hey? That one's mine. This one? Mine. This one? Mine. This one? Mine. Wait, take 1 out. I'm taking 1 out for my name. No. That's 2 now. Yeah. So you got 2. I have just 1. Yeah, me too. No, this one's yours. No, it's not. Oh, yeah. Oh, no, this one is mine. Yeah, that one's yours. And you got fair, I have 1. And who cares? No, who cares? No. Because 7 is mine. No, we've already put...
So you kind of get the point. So this is one example where teachers notice all sorts of things through these videos. It was really productive, and I'll show you some of the preliminary analysis that we've conducted on it. But in this case, for example, they noticed some of the things that they talked about was that they realized that what looks like to them from their sort of vantage point as kids kind of off task, kind of fooling around, they got to intervene as they get back to work, was actually serious work from the perspective of the kids, right? Like they were negotiating these contributions and they were sort of taking seriously the idea that they all needed to be represented. Our teachers and our research team got together at 3 points across the year to kind of do this work. And it followed up from a pretty intensive week-long summer PD. And what we found, this is a sort of work this is our first stab at analyzing the PD, was that teachers, was that what teachers noticed, what built across the academic year. Their early noticings were around sort of early on, kind of really noticing the challenges of collaboration for students. So there was just a lot of noticing that this was hard work and that students were working very hard to do it. Second thing they noticed were sort of a lot of noticings around the utility of social negotiation. So things like the negotiation of whose sticks were going to be included, or what role certain people were going to play, or who was going to sort of work with whom or with what materials. Those kinds of negotiations actually were quite powerful and important in moving the work forward. A bit later on, the noticings were really kind of noticing the role of authority and its importance. So it led to sort of developing this shared rationale for locating authority within students. And then toward the end, teachers were really focusing on what we call the brass tacks of collaboration. Like, what were the specific details that made collaboration work? How were bodies oriented? What words were being used? But interestingly, the ways that teachers connected those noticings to practice were the same all year long. Regardless of what they were noticing, they often mapped it back to practice by reinterpreting prior experiences. So this is one where they were like, now that I think about it, like I remember this time when, maybe it was the case that actually, right, often attributing far more competence and actually far more engagement in the task itself than teachers were sort of previously realizing about their students. Another way of connecting it was that they were kind of constantly mapping those noticings into this broader terrain of collaborative work. So how the struggles shifted from kindergarten through 4th grade, how they kind of connected it to what they were seeing in their language arts class or whatnot with the same kids. And then finally, they were also just regularly kind of taking what they were noticing and identifying value and kind of naming what was needed to achieve it. So then teachers responded to these noticings and verbalized connections to practice in their own ways. And I'll give you 2 brief examples. This is a 1st grade teacher who really wanted to support her students in orienting to one another's ideas and engaging and sort of taking into consideration one another's ideas. And she decided that her students really just did not have the tools to even know how to do that, and she wanted to teach them explicitly how to revoice one another's ideas. So in this clip, this is the 2nd time that they come together to revisit this idea of revoicing. In the first one, she kind of modeled it, they practiced it again, and then they went and tried it out. Here, they're launching a new lesson, they're practicing revoicing again, and she's building on it to include the need to establish agreement. So you'll see the kids kind of practice this, and then the clip jumps to a particular small group, and you see the 2 students just sort of take this up. I sort of shortened this clip. They're practicing for quite a bit.
Please thank your partner. Put your record right behind you, hands in your lap. Let's do this quickly.
So this part starts sort of right here, but she's gonna say, can you?
6 because you put
She starts explaining.
And then take away 6. 5, 6, and then 6 more. I heard you say that there was 12 people in the Yeah.
The fourth grade teacher went in a really different direction with her students. She decided to, all of the teachers at some level kind of had the same activity structure where they launched the lesson of that day with a whole class carpet discussion. Then students went off and did their table work, and then they came back to the carpet for sort of like a closing whole class discussion. And she focused in particular on kind of launching the math and launching the task. So what she did here was that she included in these launching and then later reflection conversations questions around how do we do this work together? What does it mean to be productive? What does it look like? What does it sound like? Which I'll show you a clip of. And then when they would come back from their collaborative work, she would say, you know, how did it go? Who found it hard? What was hard about it? They would surface these issues, and then she'd go back to the students and say, well, who has successful partnerships? What advice do you have? So her goal was much like positioning students with sort of the agency and kind of ownership of their mathematical ideas. She also wanted to position them with that sort of ownership of the collaborative process itself. And you see over the course of the year, students, you know, she's able to sort of launch it. They pick their partners. They realize maybe they shouldn't be working with their best friend, right? They, you know, so you're seeing them sort of more fluidly kind of take on ownership over the dynamic. So in this clip, you just see her first attempt to kind of introduce this idea and to help students start thinking about what does it look like and sound like to have these kinds of collaboration.
It is still our math work time. So I'm thinking of a word that will help us to remember what we should do, even when there's distraction. So what kind of a work time do we need to have? Diana? What? A productive work time. And can you remind us what that means? Let's wait who's in your group and think about who you think you can be productive with. When you have someone that you think you can be productive with, can you just show me a thumbs up? Go, and then you can stand up and find your partner. Everyone should have their notebooks and their pen in their hands.
They find their partners and they sit back down.
Okay, so who would like to be an actor with me to pretend to be my partner? Sebastian. Come up here. So let's pretend Sebastian and I are partners. How do we need to sit so that we can work together? Someone explain what we should do with our bodies, and we'll do it. Okay. Alexis? Okay. Sit. You suggesting we sit? Okay. How should we sit? Right.
So I'll pause here because I want to make sure we get time to chat, but this sort of conversation kind of continues around on how else might we sit, how might we orient our bodies, how might we speak to each other. So in conclusion, some of the thoughts that come out of this and that I've been kind of ruminating over is authority relations seem to really drive the collaborative problem-solving process in ways that mediate both the social construction of learning or the social construction of knowledge and of identity. The negotiation of authority, both intellectual and social, can become complicated by broader social and cultural histories about who can enact power and in what ways. Likewise, teachers can learn to notice these dynamics and connect their noticings to practice in ways that support increasingly shared authority among students, promoting both equity and productivity. And thank you. Questions?
Yes, your whole presentation, I've been wondering if you have applied this framework in multilingual settings? And what have you found that is different from monolingual, traditional monolingual classrooms?
I have not. I wanted to. So years ago when I was in Miami, I put in a proposal to do exactly that because I had a hunch that when students, bilingual students in dual language spaces where they can use the entirety of their kind of linguistic repertoire, that there would be expanded sort of access to different positional identities of power. So I was just very curious about how these dynamics might work differently in that space. But I wasn't able to get I wasn't able to do it. So it's still on my mind, and I'd love to think about that. But I haven't done it. But I would conjecture that in thinking in particular about language learners, that in spaces where English is the language of instruction and mathematics is happening in English, and those negotiations are therefore kind of linguistically restricted, that we're gonna see students having sort of navigating more narrow pathways of negotiating sort of ideas and identities of power than in these more linguistically expanded spaces where students can they have a more holistic repertoire to do that negotiating with. I was curious to see if that would be the case, but yeah.
I will also be curious, like these programs that are 50-50,
Yeah.
where Hispanic students are the language authority for the
Yes.
others to learn
Yes.
the language. How, if that will position them if it will be different when they are negotiating in Spanish, because they are the authority,
Yes.
and when the others are negotiating with them in English, that
Would be particularly cool, because in those spaces where, I know they have different models, but there's models where they're essentially taking two math classes, the contenido and then
And they have to
the
pass
English
them both.
one, and they have to pass them both. So these are the same students
That'd be interesting.
doing, similar work with different languages being emphasized. How would that sort of affect the power plays that go on? Yeah, it'd be really interesting. And sort of the implications for like the vast majority of schools that are language restricted in English only. So yeah, that would be really interesting.
And with the mathematics, they can show, display their competency
Right,
as well, yeah.
right.
This doesn't play into your dream experiment. The idea that we're collecting in San Francisco middle schools right now, we have lots of
Yeah.
small groups of students. There's some number of the classrooms where students are using what I assume is their first language, it's at least a language other than English. They're not the dual.
Right, it's bilingual. That's the
Well,
one.
no, it's
no.
monolingual,
Yeah, it's
and the
monolingual.
kids are using
The
their
kids are
language, is
using
one
it.
scenario. But then we
but,
also have a
yeah.
Mandarin classroom,
Well, we
don't
also, so it's interesting because like it's all different contexts. So
Yeah.
sometimes the teacher,
I'm gonna move over here.
sometimes the teacher, her first language is other than English.
Right,
And so she will instruct bilingually,
right.
and there's other instances where
Right.
the teacher will instruct monolingually, but in her first language.
Right,
Which
right,
might
right.
be Mandarin. And so in all of those classrooms, it's been a really fascinating, interesting thing where, one interaction that I've been looking at is specifically like where there are 3 kids who are all English language learners. One's newcomer, one's been there a couple of years, and one is, I think second generation, because they kind of talk about it in Spanish to each other, and the one says, no, I want to speak English,
Right.
I don't want to speak Spanish.
Yeah.
But he totally knows everything that's going on, and the other student doesn't know what's going on in English, and it's
Right.
just like, but the teacher is bilingual,
Yeah,
and will enter and speak in the languages that the kids prefer. There's a lot
Yeah.
going on.
yeah.
But then we have other
classes.
classrooms where I'm pretty sure the teacher doesn't know the kid's language,
Yes.
and
Right.
particularly when it's
It's-
Spanish, Anthony can pick up what they're saying.
Yeah, it's like, it's so fascinating, sorry, there's like,
Yeah.
but it's,
yeah.
I wonder about like, because in these kind of like, in those kind of spaces, how the intellectual authority does shift when one student asserts that they're going to do it in this language,
Mhm.
and then all of a sudden the other one asserts, no, we're gonna do it in this, and the kid gets caught in between. There's a lot like that keeps playing on that.
So when you're ready for another data set.
If you would like another corpus to like dissect.
I don't know, do you think we're ready for another data set?
Do you want to go on?
Do it.
Well, and I think that my question bridges we're teasing but not teasing.
Yeah, we're really not.
When you think about your framework that you put up at the very beginning.
Yes.
In your mind, does it transcend grade level and subject matter?
Yes. So it was originally developed through a science debate.
That's what I thought.
At the elementary level. But I've applied it at the secondary level as well.
It looked content neutral to me.
Right.
Yeah.
The reason I find it it's sort of like both and. Yes, I do think it is applicable across the board in thinking about how ideas become influential. I think that how it plays out in mathematics is particularly interesting to me because of a couple of reasons. Like one, on the one hand, the role of mathematics as a discipline infused with a great deal of power. So just access to that identity as a powerful math learner it's got kind of high stakes. And what it means to be a mathematics kind of person is so fundamentally infused with intellectual authority and competence. And it's itself very loaded intellectual authority because it's so linked to smartness and sort of general intelligence. Like if you're good in math, you're smart.
Right.
And if you're great in math, you're like a genius, right? So there's so much at stake with math, especially around authority and who gets access to it, that I think that these dynamics play out particularly saliently and interestingly. But regardless, yes, I do think that this idea around getting access to the floor and being oriented to, and how students orient to ideas and who becomes influential is sort of, in fact, when we were first developing this model, it was during a time of the presidential elections, like this was a while back, and we kept seeing the same sorts of
I was just gonna, I had that same, you
that
those up and I
our local
just,
student was doing.
right, I was seeing all the
grab
debates
the
from a
floor
year
and
ago.
to grab the space and like to assert these
Yeah.
ridiculous things that their party members would be like, that is a brilliant idea, you know, and we'd just be like, oh my god, we could like map
Yeah.
American politics through this. So I do think it's
Immaturity.
broader
That was
than
gonna be one of my
that,
other
but-
questions.
Yeah, I think we grown-ups are not immune to such things, yeah. Yeah.
Did you happen to see like, so you kind of got to it at the last two clips of teachers, like in your PDs, how mathematics is kind of like set up as less of a privileged, powerful, because I mean, we think of like mathematics as like a power thing and contributing to the intellectual authority, but was there a shift in the way the teachers talked about mathematics and what mathematics was and how answers were, and then we probably saw shifts within the groups themselves?
Well, certainly, with this particular group of teachers, they had been for a few years, this is at the elementary level, so they're teaching all subject areas, and they had been for a few years in their language arts class doing like readers and writers workshop, and in science doing inquiry. Like they had become comfortable and really loved kind of collaborative student-centered approaches in everything but math. Like math was the thing where math is different, you can't teach it that way, right? Like, how do you even do this? And how this all started was that then our steppies were in their classrooms, these were their CTs, and they were doing context for learning lessons, they were doing collaborative lessons, and the teachers were like, oh, will you show us how to do this? Like, will you support us in doing this? So once they kind of saw the vision for math, it was really powerful because, first of all, math could then fit seamlessly throughout their day. Like all day long, they're creating these spaces for students. Some of the things that they noticed were that moves that they kind of do in these other content spaces could also help in math. What I didn't see with these teachers, because they didn't come in with this lens, was this idea that like math is right or wrong. There wasn't really resistance. There was more like, I don't see how we can do this, and then there was like, oh my gosh, we can do this, let's do this. They did recast like their prior experiences with their students over and over again. They're like, oh, I'm like seeing so many things differently. But we didn't have with this particular group that kind of resistance of like, well, real math is right and wrong and procedurally oriented. It wasn't quite that. Although other times I've worked with teachers, certainly that's a big space of resistance to sort of talk through, yeah.
Did they choose their interventions? You know how you modeled what the teachers did with their kids?
Yes.
Not you modeled, you showed the videos. Did they choose those solutions, interventions, whatever you want to label them?
Yes.
How did they come up with that?
So in our PD, we would watch these clips and discuss and notice and then just sort of, piggyback on each other's ideas. And then they would reflect on, well, what does it seem like students need? So some of the things might be like, well, they need greater support on how to do this. Like, they need to be taught, even to the point that like bodies should be oriented to each other. They need to be taught like how to listen and then, how, so that was sort of one, and then teachers kind of ran with that. So I guess the answer is in the reflection of what do students need, and then our final prompt was like, what might you try next? And so it became very playful, and they wanted to sort of try out these things. And they tried out different things, and we sort of kept following them. And so they kind of just came up with it there together, not individually. It was all socially sort of, it was in discussion. Some ideas became exciting to particular teachers, and they wanted to try those things out. And then other ideas became exciting to other teachers, and they wanted to try those things out. Yeah.
I want to piggyback. You said something that, because I've heard some pushback from teachers about the idea of what participation means from like, they have a lot of immigrants from different countries and how eye gaze may not be as socially acceptable or talking without being talking to. So I'm wondering in that whole discussion about what it means to listen to your partner, like how student generated was that? Or was it like the teacher kind of fishing for like, this is what I think the normative like participatory like learning structure or listen, do you see what I'm going with that?
Yeah.
I'm interested in
On the end of sort of the who the students were culturally and linguistically, the focus was actually more early on. This was early on. It then was, once they started kind of doing this work, it wasn't as much of a concern. But early on, they thought, how do we do this work with our kids in math when our kids are language learners across different languages, and this is math discourse, which is particularly academic. They might not have these words in either language. Like, how do we facilitate these discussions in math when they're still learning the language of instruction? That feels like a really big obstacle. So we brought in Judith Moscovich, right, from UC Santa Cruz. That's her bread and butter, and she worked with, this was over the summer. Like, the summer was a pretty intensive PD where we were just trying to lay the groundwork and get on the same page around how to launch this work and how to think about this work. But there wasn't ever really conversation around feeling like their kids. There was definitely a lot of developmental conversations, like the kindergarten teacher being like, what I can expect from the kids is not that much, and she kept sort of pushing herself to see how much their competencies really actually could be at such a young age. But there wasn't really any conversation around, from a cultural perspective, my kids might want to interact in different ways with one another. Yeah.
Well, at the same time, I'm wondering maybe that's where the teacher's role comes in. They make it explicit. In this classroom, when we do math or when we learn this, we position our bodies directly toward each other, or we look at each other.
Yes, right.
That's why it needs to be articulated.
Yeah.
But I don't know, but then like what are the implications of, the teacher setting that as the standard for this class? I don't know.
Right.
which is a great conversation to have.
It is a great conversation to have, yeah. I mean, those kinds of issues were much more likely to be framed, and I think it made sense because it was a multi-year team, like kindergarten through fourth grade was represented. So it often was from a developmental perspective, like what have they learned to do yet or are capable of doing at this point. All of the teachers agreed that all of the students needed much more support in the mechanics of how to do this, that they realized that they assumed that you can put kids together and sort of say, go work together, unless they'd have a sense of how to do that and what that means. And in watching it, they thought, well, they're working really hard to do this, like harder than I realized, but man, it is hard, and they need to be taught So it's actually kind of really interesting where one of the insights was maybe the like direct instruction is really around these sort of interactional mechanisms and not the content. And if we can just get those sorts of tools out, then we're creating the conditions under which they can really explore the math and discover ideas on their own, which was exciting and which kind of bore out over time.
Wondering about the explanations that like the students give when their bids aren't accepted, right?
Mm-hmm.
The explanations of how, like Brianna, standard explanation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how, are you noticing interesting patterns there, like that maybe Brianna's absolutely correct that it was that an unfair playing field in that situation. Are you noticing anything about the student reactions there? And do you think that's an interesting area for intervention?
Yeah.
Like that metacognitive sort of
Right.
space, yeah.
So I've got like two different thoughts on that.
Yeah.
On the one hand, with these kids, this is actually an analysis we're doing right now. It's exciting analysis. So interactionally, what would they do when their bids were rejected? So what we're finding is that often kids shift to off-task talk. This has been a really interesting analysis in noticing that like in the full range of when kids go off task or start socializing, that actually it seems like a relative minority of the time, it's just sort of a lost cause, they just unravel and they're just sort of, it's not kind of going anywhere. For a large chunk of it, we're like in this analysis right now, so I'm like conclusive,
right.
But it actually has productive functions. So for example, students who, I'll give one example, like the Minecraft example. So there's a student who, they're at a table with others and they're bidding for the floor, they're bidding for materials, there's just bid after bid after bid, and he's just totally ignored. So he shifts into talk about Minecraft, and he's like, I was playing Minecraft, and I was on this horse, and I was the first one on the horse, and I was setting the villages on fire, and you see interaction, like all the bodies kind of shift to him, right? The gaze shifts to him, right? And at that moment, he reaches over, he grabs the materials, he grabs the box, he gives his contribution that they should put the 10 sticks into that basket, and they all get like on task. Right, so there's lots of like moments like that where, or a student who like wants to get on task, but nobody else really is, and they'll go into off-task conversation that just sort of starts recruiting students into it, and then it shifts into on-task talk. So one thing we're finding, like the way I theorize around that is from the sort of discourse of mathematics, right? So just from the realm of mathematics, there's only so many positions that one can enter into, and if you don't have quite access through that discourse, you're sort of blocked off. And so when students start pulling on youth popular culture, sort of other kinds of spaces like friendships and whatnot, it expands kind of the realm of positional possibilities, and they can find other spaces of power that at the minimum serve to gain attention, which sometimes that's all it does and doesn't do much more, but often it goes beyond just gaining the attention, and they can enter or recruit. Yeah. Oh, then the other one about Brianna. This is something I think about a lot, because for years people would say, well, you know, in the broader study, you're seeing all of these things that the teacher did. The teacher did all sorts of fabulous things, right? So it's just like, great. Like what, you know, what are we supposed to do? And but in thinking about what these teachers did, like in particular, the 4th grade teacher, around asking the question, like, what does it mean to do this work? What might be hard about it? I could imagine, as a thought experiment, right? We didn't actually do this, but I could imagine that this teacher could have engaged in that kind of conversation. So this is not something that he did, right? And that potentially this idea of like boys don't listen to girls becomes surfaced. And it can become confronted and sort of dealt with, along with whatever other problematic dynamics that I didn't happen to capture because the camera wasn't on those kids. So I do feel like some of the things that we're gleaning here can have broader intervention type possibilities, even when, so at the elementary level, it might not be particularly kind of socio-political and the kinds of things that kids talk about and surface. At the secondary level, it certainly might more likely, but it might create an entry into those kinds of conversations, very much grounded in sort of how do we do this work, right? So yeah.
I just found the off-task thing was really interesting to me because I think so many times teachers get stuck in a situation as an adversary coming over,
Yeah,
and then it changes the role of the teacher and the student, the lack of trust.
yes,
And if that message could be explained to teachers that sometimes you have to just let it go
yes.
a little and good things.
Yeah. Part
I
of what
can't tell
we're,
you how many times I've made a mistake and put my foot in my mouth and that kid was looking up, especially in high school, it's harder with devices, was actually looking something up online or doing something on Desmos and like,
right,
you know.
yes. Yeah, I agree. Like, in fact, we're finding like when the teacher comes, more often than not, it just sort of blows things up. But, so we're not there yet, but we almost want to create like kind of like a triage model, right?
Yeah.
Like of the larger realm of off-task talk, what are some signs that you shouldn't step in, just let them struggle and be? And when do you step in? When is it the case that they think they're done, so now they're gonna be kind of playing around? You should intervene and say, well, how about this, right? Or kind of point out maybe they're not done, they think they're done, but they there's more to do. Or maybe they are done and you gotta give them sort of another challenge. That's a big one, they think they're done. So they kind of dismantle and maybe they're really not. Another one that does happen is that they're just avoiding work. So what does it look like when they're avoiding work rather than kind of struggling through getting a foothold or sort of recruiting one another? We're trying to get those patterns out so that we can offer that as a resource to teachers too. Like when you're looking around at the gaze and you're sort of listening in, that's one of them. It's like before stepping in, just kind of stop and look and listen from behind for a little bit. Right, kind of diagnose what's happening rather than just walking in. So little things like that, but it's like definitely on our minds in conversation.
And I wonder if that the teacher thought in the
excuse me,
the Jerome in the Miami in the Florida, whether she was if the camera was not on, whether she would have jumped in there, but she felt embarrassed that her kids were
right. So maybe
that's something with research. I guess you've dealt with a lot though.
There were multiple cameras, so they weren't the only group. There were multiple groups on there. But that might have been the case. She might have been a little bit extra heightened with Jerome because he was one of the groups with the cameras on and she knew that we were going to be sort of videotaping that. I didn't see any kind of heightened attention to any of the other groups that had cameras on them with respect to the teacher. But then I think, like, even if that were the case, that we sort of kind of tainted that interaction a bit through the existence of just sort of being there, it's sort of nevertheless the case that it showed, like, how powerful those evaluations can be in setting those dynamics in motion. I think, so this isn't in the paper because unlike in the Brianna Kofi one where Brianna herself, and Kofi also in other interviews gives this gendered interpretation, I don't have those words coming out of the kids' mouths, but if you kind of situate it in other literatures around the policing of Black boys, right, and their behaviors in particular, you kind of see that this follows a pattern that you see elsewhere. So I think that was at play, but it may be the case that it was exacerbated because it was one of the ones with the camera in front. Yeah. An interesting thing with this group though, Anna and Jerome talking about like how that original sort of positioning can set the stage for things. There's another moment where Anna and Jerome have to work together again, and there's, it has nothing to do with the lesson. It's a separate thing where they do like online math homework that's just sort of drill and procedures, like sort of shooting math answers or whatever, math facts. And she had posted like the top scorers on the board. And they were about to start their work, and Anna looked over and happened to notice that Jerome was the #1 top scorer. And she was like, what? And so Jerome was like, yeah. And so when they started, you're seeing Anna give all those same directives, like, do this, we're gonna do that. But Jerome, because this was like, I think, that original positioning, like set a different stage, he was much more likely to be like, nope, you're not gonna do that. We're gonna do this. We're doing it this way, right? And it really evened things out between them. So so this was also the teacher, although in a very different way. So this part about, like, it resonates with some of the complex instruction stuff around status intervention, right? Like, in one case, his status was sort of demoted from an engagement perspective, and the other one, his status was sort of elevated from like a smartness or whatever, top scoring kind of perspective, and it mattered, even just like in those local moments. Yeah.
Wow. All right, we're welcome to continue the conversation casually. There are treats and beverages outside the door. Help yourself to those because they don't keep forever. But let's thank Jenny for the thoughtful engagement. And you're all gonna think about how you engage with whom. Tonight, tomorrow, and beyond.
Yeah, right.
I was gonna ask you, when I first looked
Yeah.
at your own homework,
Right.
like if the task for me and you didn't want to deal with it.
Yeah, yeah.
But you did longer than I have. And she did doing something and maybe didn't.
So, yeah, so it's hard to kind of get all of it out in a busy talk.
Yeah, I wanna-
Yeah, how